Hi, welcome to Herd Nerds. I have a wonderful guest, Dr. Brandon Smith. He's won many awards of excellence and also special achievement. He is amazing in the world of fatty acids, and he is a specialist in forage systems, something I don't really know that much about, and I'm sure many of you can't wait to hear him talk about that too. So he's going to stay around for a little bit and tell us about your fatty acid profiles on the meat that we submitted here at Auburn, and also he's going to talk to you so you are able to understand when you get your fatty acid profile on your beef. And that's something we've never had. And I am so happy to be able to welcome Dr. Smith to our program. And thank you. Oh, and you're in trouble, y'all, because he's an Alabama native too. So I am really glad to welcome him. Hi, Dr. Smith. So glad you're here.
Thank you, Danzy. I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here.
So why don't we start out, talking? I know you saw the steaks from the Triple Crown and you did the fatty acid profile. So just have at it telling my entrants how they can look at their results and read their results and understand fatty acids.
Well, the good thing is we take all the complex stuff on the back end and simplify it down to a nice report. So that's the best thing that I can tell all of your entrants there, because when it comes to the machinery, what we're doing on my end is, we're taking your sample, we blend it down where you can't even recognize that it's meat anymore. We throw it in this nice solution where it'll pull all the fatty acids out of the tissue, and then we shoot it into this nice big box. And I like to call it the big black box because nobody really knows what's going on in there. Well, let me phrase it. Some chemists know what's going on in there. People smarter than me, they know what's happening in there. But we're taking this solution and we're shooting in a sample of your meat. And what's happening is it's got a long copper tube that runs through that machine, and it's heating it up to a couple of 100 degrees and making all those fatty acids into gases. And those gases run through the tube. It takes them a while to get through there. They hit the flame, and boom, on the screen, I see something that looks like that. And when I see something that looks like that, I get really excited. My grad students had to laugh at me last week because I was watching the fatty acids come off of the screen. I was getting excited every time I saw one. I loved it. It worked. It worked. But what we're seeing from that is I'm able to compare that to a standard and say, okay, fatty acid number 18, so linoleic acid, is supposed to come off at this particular time, and I know that's that fatty acid right there. And so what I'm able to do is compare those back, and what you're going to get is a report that says, as a percent of the whole and as a percent of the fatty acids, which one of those acids actually came off. And so all that exciting stuff, the copper tubing, all of that, all boils down to two lines on a report that'll say, here's the concentration of the overall meat, and here's the concentration of the fat that we measured of each of these fatty acids. And the way to interpret that report, there's a lot of different ways. You can really dive into the weeds when it comes to that. And I want your viewers to know, I'm not necessarily a fatty acid specialist. I'm a nutritionist by training. And so when it comes to fatty acids in the meat, I'm not a human nutritionist. I feed the animals, so I understand about where it goes. But I'm not their doctor or their dietitian or anything. But there's a lot of ways you can dive into that. A lot of times in science we get really hung up on the individual fatty acids. There's 37 of those fatty acids that come off in that profile, and we can look and say, oh, there's differences here, there's differences here, there's differences here. And that's good. But really what your entrants are interested in are the big ones. We know that C18, 18.0 is a big one. We know that 18.1 is a big one. We know that 20 is a big one. So, linoleic, oleic, arachidonic, the big three as far as the essential fatty acids go, those are big ones that we pay attention to. And then we start to look at how many unsaturated fatty acids, or what doctors usually call the good fats, versus how many saturated fatty acids, or what doctors normally call the bad fats. And I quote that because when it comes to nutrition, I don't really consider there to be such thing as a good fat and a bad fat. It's all about amounts. It's all about what's there. And so that's really what your interest is going to want to understand is the big three, the essential fatty acids. Those are the ones we expect to see. Those are the ones that we expect to be in the profile. And what we're looking at now is what is the relative proportion of those among the different entrants, and then how many unsaturated did we get relative to saturated.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Now, can you tell everybody what you consider the good fats and what fats are considered the not so good fats?
So, what they would generally consider to be the good fats, those good fats are going to be unsaturated fatty acids. And what that means, breaking it down, it seems like this heady concept of, oh, it's an unsaturated fatty acid. It's this magical thing. All it means is, I mean, to take, for example, if we use this remote here and say that that's a chain of fatty acids. A saturated fatty acid is going to look just like this remote. It's going to be flat. It's going to be a straight chain. And what's going to happen is off the tops and bottoms of this, or any straight object, are going to be hydrogens. And we say that every position on those carbons, because we measure fats in terms of carbon length, every position on that carbon is going to be saturated with hydrogen. There's going to be nothing else available. An unsaturated fatty acid takes one of those hydrogens away. And when it takes that hydrogen away, instead of bonding something else in that position, that straight chain breaks. And so the unsaturated fatty acid ends up breaking into this kinked molecule. We consider that better because those kinked molecules in the bloodstream don't tend to pack up as much. And that's why doctors consider those to be good fats, is because they can't layer themselves and stack as densely. And so you don't see as much plaque buildup in arteries generally.
Right. So I'm going to ask you the $1,000,000 question. So when you look at our Wagyu fatty acid profiles, are you seeing that Wagyu meat is healthier, containing the higher amounts of good fats than other breeds of beef?
So I will say that what I'm going to tell you right now is not based on the Triple Crown entries of this year, because I'm blinded to what those entries were. So all I see is an entry number and a fatty acid profile. So I can't tell you from this, but I will tell you based on outstanding research that it does exist. In general, yes, Wagyu beef does tend to have a higher concentration of the unsaturated fatty acids relative to things like Angus or Hereford, or even things like the Japanese black or the Hanwoo. They tend to deposit more unsaturated fatty acids. But I'll say for your listeners, even more important than the concentration has to do with the amount.
Right.
And yes, they're putting down more unsaturated, but let's just say, just for argument's sake, in a hypothetical world, that the Angus here in this hand and the Wagyu here in this hand had the exact same fatty acid profile. Percent of the total fat, they had the exact same profile. Even if they did, the Wagyu is going to have more unsaturated fats because the steak itself, the muscle itself, has that much more fat in it. And so even if they had the same proportion of fatty acids, Wagyu is going to end up with more fat, or more of those unsaturated fatty acids, because it produces more fat overall.
Right. The higher fatty acid profiles, those are genetic, aren't they? You can get that from your genetics. You can breed for healthy beef. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I'll put an asterisk on that. I mean, technically, we can breed for most anything. It's a matter of how efficiently can we do it. And
Right.
so that's the disclaimer there. But yes, there is definitely a genetic component to fat deposition. And, if you look at some of the research that was done back in the early 90s, and a lot of this ended up coming out of Texas. They had a group that did a lot of work on this. And, there's been other groups that have done it. But if you compile all the research together, what we saw was that when they compared Angus and Wagyu, or any of our other traditional breeds in Wagyu, it didn't matter how long you left them on feed. They have a genetic potential that they're going to top out. And so they're going to get to a certain point. They're not going to deposit any more fat because they're genetically not capable. That's their genetic potential to lay down fat, because then what's happening metabolically in the metabolism is that once they get to that level and they're not depositing any more fat, their overall body has an energy demand. And so rather than laying down fat, they're laying down some fat, but then they're burning a little bit of fat to support themselves. And so it's a give and take, and you end up with a net zero. You end up with a wash. And
Right.
so that's where they get to that top potential. Wagyu, based on generations upon generations of breeding, just in that breed itself, just the genetics that exist in that breed, have a higher potential. So they're going to lay down more fat before they get to that net negative or net zero where everything's a trade-off.
Right. And I found in past studies when we did melting point of fat correlations to the fatty acid profiles that the animals that had the highest melting point of fat also had the highest fatty acid profile. So that made sense too.
Yes.
They
And your
were
melting
almost
points all,
identical.
yes, and the melting points all a function of the amount of unsaturated fatty acids and the amount of saturated. It's the difference in a fat and an oil. And oil tends to be an unsaturated fatty acid. A saturated fatty acid tends to be a lot firmer. And so it's a give and take. The oilier you get, the more unsaturated you are. The firmer you get, the more saturated. And it's a balancing act.
So the next question I want to ask you is, and I know the answer. I believe it's yes, but I want to hear it from a professional. Can your feed program increase your fatty acid profile, your good fats? Can it make your meat healthier by the way you feed your animal?
Well, Desi, I'm really glad you asked that question because that actually gets more to where my training.
Uh huh.
I'm punching out of my weight class when I talk about fatty acids in the meat, even though I understand the whole concept of fats and fat nutrition and all that. That's a little outside my wheelhouse, but you start getting into the feed and how it starts affecting. That's my ball game. So
That's
the
right.
answer,
That's your specialty.
that's my specialty. So the answer is resounding yes. Your feed program most definitely affects the meat quality, and that's going to go into everything, not just the fat deposition. That's going to go into yield grade. That's going to go into quality grade. That's going to go into fatty acid composition of the fat they have. All of it's going to be nutritionally related. Now it goes back to what we said a minute ago. There's a genetic potential, and you can't feed your way out of genetics, but you can't
Right.
breed your way out of bad nutrition. So
Right.
it's a give and take. So as long as the genetic potential is there, absolutely you're going to be able to feed to that certain level.
That's right. And the feed can bring out that genetic potential, and it can also help animals that don't have that genetic potential get to whatever potential they have with
Right,
feed.
right.
I believe that. Can you add lipids to your feed program to help with your fatty acid? I know I've heard of people adding corn oil products and things of this nature, and olive feed, and we talked about the use of fish oil in the feed, and can that up the fatty acid profile?
Yes, but you end up. Yeah, I feel like every answer I'm giving you is a yes, but, or here's the asterisk, here's the exception. Yes, it can change the fatty acid profile, absolutely. The difference is how everything happens, and I know you and I have talked about you are what you eat, and that is true,
Right.
but that's more true in things like humans and pigs, in our
Okay.
monogastric animals, because what goes in gets digested, enters the bloodstream, gets deposited. Ruminant animals are a really special animal because of that pre-gastric fermentation. So before it hits the actual stomach, we're dealing with the rumen. We're dealing with the vat of microbes that are working there. And that's the big difference on can you feed this and result in this? Because if I were to feed a pig a bunch of oil, I mean, they've shown this in studies over and over and over again. The higher the oil content gets, the oilier the bacon gets because I'm adding those unsaturated fats. In cattle, I can start adding oil, and I'm not necessarily going to go that direction immediately. And it's a balance between what gets broken down the rumen versus what escapes the rumen, because as particles are small enough, they escape the rumen and wind up going into the stomach, into the small intestine, get broken down. And so things like you're talking about, the olive fed or the fish oil, corn oil, a lot of those, because of the small particle size, we do see an increase in unsaturated fatty acids because a lot of that material is escaping the rumen before it's broken down. If it stays in the rumen long enough to be broken down, fat and microbes or bacteria don't get along.
Yeah, they don't. They're like
Yeah,
oil and water.
absolutely. Absolutely, and that's a very good analogy, oil and water, because bacteria love water. They're an
That's
aqueous
right.
organism. They love water. They don't like an oil, and so there's a lot of different theories that exist, and scientists have been debating this for decades, centuries, on what theory it is that's happening, whether the oil is coating the microbe or whether it's coating the feed particle that the microbe might break down. It might be interfering with the lipid membrane. I can't tell you. I did some of this work back in my master's, and I couldn't tell you. I can tell you something happens. It's one of those theories. I tend to think it's probably all four of the theories combined, but they don't get along. And so what happens when a fat enters the rumen is the microbes attack it. They attack it, and what we were talking about earlier, those straight chains that have those hydrogens up and down, the
Right.
saturated fats, that's what they prefer. Those fats don't interfere with them as much. Whereas if we have the kinked fatty acid, the unsaturated fatty acid, those tend to interfere a lot. And so we end up with what's known as biohydrogenation. So the bacteria in the rumen will come in and they'll attach hydrogens to the fat and make it a more saturated fatty acid. And time again in studies, we've seen you feed unsaturated fats and the unsaturated fats wind up in the rumen. They come out of the rumen as saturated fats. And so it's very difficult to get unsaturated fatty acids into a ruminant animal because of what's happening there. And it all has to do with, can you allow it to leave the rumen without being broken down? That's where increasing things like olive cake or the corn oil can work, but you've got to be cautious because
Right.
there's a reason that cattle don't put down a lot of unsaturated fatty acids to begin with. And what
Right.
you were talking about earlier, you increase the unsaturated fatty acid profile, but it comes with consequences. We get
That's right.
oilier fats, we get fat, kind of seeping or leaking when it's cooked. In the fish oil case that you were talking about, and they've seen this across species, there's a limit on how much fish oil you can put in because it depends on whether or not you want steak or pork or bacon or whatever to taste like fish.
That's right. And I brought that up because, and I'll say it again. In a past podcast, I brought up about how we had this fabulous steak and they were feeding it, a omega-3 and omega-6 enhancer but they didn't realize it had fish oil in it. They were just so happy they were gaining so much weight.
Yes.
And when we got the steaks, they were gorgeous, and I couldn't wait to taste it. And I tasted it. I'm like, oh, what is this? They on their flavor profiles, it was off taste. And I'm like, oh my God. So when you do use lipids, when you add lipids to your feed, you need to also be thinking about the after effect of what you add to your feed and how it can affect your flavor profile.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's not
If you
just
don't
in
mind everything, tasting like fish, it's not a problem.
No, it didn't even taste like fish. It just tasted oily and yucky. It had that, I don't know, I can't even describe it, but you need to think about how you are. And that's something I'd like for you to talk about too is, people don't even understand what they put in their feed and how much it affects their flavor profile.
Oh, it absolutely does. All of my meat scientist friends will tell you fat equals flavor. And the reason for that is most of the flavor compounds or even the smell compounds, the aromatics, are lipid soluble. They're hydrophobic. They don't like water. And so, you can feed a lot of things, and all of that flavor and smell is normally tied up in the fat. So it's absolutely, what you're feeding is going to change its flavor profile because as you increase fat, you increase flavor. But then depending on where that fat came from, it carries some of those aromatic compounds with it from the source.
Right. And we were able to test at Auburn for the aromatic property in the new lab. I was so excited to get to that too. I mean, there's so much we can talk about. It's what they can test for in that lab. I just couldn't believe it. But we did that with our Triple Crown steaks this year. So I'm excited to see that too.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. And I like that you brought up cautioning them on the adding the fats, adding the lipids to the diet, what it can do on the flavor. I'll tell you too, kind of that conversation we were having on bacteria and fat. There's a top end of fat that you can add before you start actually changing what they can digest. And most studies over the years, what we've seen is if you feed 5% of the dry matter as fat, you're okay. Anything over 5% of the dry matter, and you actually start to see that the animal quits digesting fiber as efficiently. And I mean, it's a ruminant animal. Fiber is the main energy source. Even if you move them onto a grain based ration, they've got to have a certain amount of fiber to survive. And increasing that fat over a threshold means they're less efficient at breaking the fiber down.
I see. So 5% is the goal.
5%. Every once in a while, you can see data that say 8%, but somewhere in that range. You don't want to see a 10%, 12%, 15% fat ration, really pouring oil into it. Or, yes, it's going to really back down what you can do in terms of fiber digestion.
So I guess for people that put tubs out, they need to be aware of the fat content in those tubs too. Because I've seen some, 5, 8, and 10% fat. And so, I mean, I guess they need to check that along with their forage, which takes us into your forte about forages.
Yes, ma'am. The tub, absolutely. The neat thing about tubs or self-feeding type feeds is that they normally have something in there to limit intake. And so the 10% fat in there is okay as long as that's not all they're eating. And
Mm-hmm.
hopefully it's been blended where they're not going to consume more than a pound or two of that a day. But absolutely, check your label on those. If it is a high fat, then keep an eye on how quickly that's going away. You don't want them consuming that much fat or you're going backward instead of forward.
Right,
The
right,
forages, yes, that's absolutely my forte. That was what I got my PhD in. That was forage agronomy. So I'm really focused on forage based feeding. Now, of course, I love the grain based rations. I'm not necessarily. It has to be grass fed. It has to be grain fed. It has to be fed.
right,
That's where I stay. It
right.
has to be fed. And so,
But
but I
we all
really enjoy the forage programs.
even if we feed grain, we feed, we feed hay. So that is grain. When I have my hay field set up, I've always cut at a certain time because I was told there's a certain time that you're at optimal nutrition. And when you go past that, you start losing your nutrition. Is that true?
That is true. That is true. And it's time, but it's more or what we call physiological maturity. So it's not necessarily you're watching your watch or you're watching the calendar. It's you're watching the field. And that's where I talk about the balance on forage feeding. If you're looking for optimal nutrition out of that hay field, what you're looking for is the last point in time that the grass is growing before it puts on a seed head. So once the grass puts on a seed head, it is going what we call reproductive. Once the grass goes reproductive, all of it's fulfilling the biological imperative. It's doing the same thing that animals do. When they're fulfilling a biological imperative, they grow to their maturity. And once they reach their maturity, energy gets diverted into reproduction. And that's just the biological imperative of all living things. Same thing's happening in the grass. The grass is putting its energy into growth, and that growth is in terms of additional dry matter, in terms of protein, in terms of non-structural carbohydrates, so the free carbohydrates that are easily broken down, the cell wall carbohydrates, the fiber that we talked about the animal's going to get. But once it reaches its peak, once it attains physiological maturity, it's going to divert its energy. So anything that it's getting in photosynthesis gets diverted from growth to reproduction. And once it gets diverted to reproduction, that last stalk will come up with the seed head, and any energy now is going into seed production. Once that energy goes in seed production, we don't see an increase in nutritive value or in quality of any of the grass itself. Really, we see a decrease because a lot of those leaves get more mature. We pull protein out of the leaves, it goes to the seed. We pull non-structural carbohydrates, they end up going to the roots or to the seed. And so you end up with higher fiber, lower digestibility. And so that ideal time is the last leaf before it puts on the seed head. That is the perfect time to harvest hay. Now, we would normally say if you could harvest it 7 days into growth, that's going to be the highest quality grass you can ever get, but you're going to have a hard time finding a hay cutter that can ever go out and harvest it. You may end up with a third of a bale to the acre, if that. And so that's the trade-off we get, is that's the highest quality you can get and still actually be able to harvest it.
Right. And of course, when it's the perfect time to harvest, that's when Mother Nature decides to rain
Oh, of course, of
every day
course.
for weeks.
Of course, that always happens. If you need a rain, go try to bale hay.
That's right. That's
Drought, bale
right.
hay.
That's right. I mean, it's that I tell you, I have to give it to people that grow hay and bale hay, because it is a constant fight with Mother Nature to get it, optimal.
It
Optimal.
is that.
So, and another thing I learned is that I just learned this year that, and in the South, I don't know, is Johnson grass pervasive in other places, or is it just a Southern thing?
It's more so a southern thing. It's a warm season species, so we don't see it much outside of the South. It can grow some other places, but it's mainly us.
Yeah, well, I just found out that it was highly toxic at a certain stage. Is that true?
That is true, and I want to caution your listeners that don't avoid Johnson grass. I'm not telling them to avoid Johnson grass, because Johnson grass itself is a very good forage. It's a sorghum species, and most of our sorghum species are very digestible. They're good grasses. But any of the sorghum species, so Johnson grass, sorghum Sudan grass, even grain sorghum, have a tendency to have nitrates or prussic acid. And it's all about nitrogen storage. The plant is storing nitrogen to use later. And what the certain time that you're talking about is normally after some type of stressful event. So either immediately after a drought or immediately after a frost is when we start to see these things. And what's happening there is immediately after drought or immediately after frost, when it's coming out of dormancy. In frost, those cells ruptured. In drought, the cells shrunk down because they were desiccated. In either case, what's happening, especially on the prussic acid side, is what's happening is the nitrogen storage, it's in a form that it's just there. And then there's an enzyme in the cell wall that when they combine, it releases the cyanide molecule from that prussic acid. And so what's happening is producing hydrogen cyanide, which
I
is a
see.
toxic gas.
Mm-hmm.
So immediately after it starts growing, it's mobilizing the nitrogen. It's trying to regrow. It's mobilizing the nitrogen back up. But it's ruptured those cell walls. And so we see the enzyme coming in contact with the nitrogen that's being mobilized. There's also enzymes in the saliva that can mobilize with that. And you see that. So really what we say is, if Johnson grass or sorghum Sudan grass or anything is stressed, and then it starts to regrow, stay off of it for the first several days or week after it starts regrowth.
I see. And also, we have to deal with toxins in our forage. You want to talk? Do they have that out west? Do they have to deal with so much stuff like we do here?
They do. They do. I would say it's about a worldwide thing. It's kind of the fun of my job in doing the forage side of things, is
Hmm.
because the animals there are getting the plant and it's trying to survive. It's adapted its mechanisms. And that's why I studied agronomy, honestly, was to learn how to feed animals better. Because if you study the plant as a plant biologist or as an agronomist, the plant is there coming up with defensive mechanisms to beat itself against the animal. And so the animal is trying to be better. If you build a better mousetrap, you find a better mouse. And it's give and take between the animal and the forage on which one is getting a better defense mechanism. So yes, they do deal with it, just in different species. Theirs are more the fact that in the western U.S. they have very low rainfall, and so
Right,
their species, it's a matter of any toxins that might exist get really concentrated because there's not much water there.
right, right. And
Or
we
they've
get
got
tons of
coatings
it.
that help them from desiccating that prevent them from being eaten.
So, what part of the U.S. has the most prolific and best grasses for cattle?
Ooh, now you're putting me on the spot, Daisy.
I just want to know, I'm in northern Alabama on the Tennessee line, and I wanted to go up where the black belt was, but they got those prices up there too. So
Yes,
I
yeah.
tell you,
So
buying land in the black belt was pretty high. So
yes. Well, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm biased. So you're on the Tennessee line. I grew up on the Florida line. I grew up in South Alabama. I'm biased. I will tell you the South has the most potential. But if you ask me about just the overall best grasses, I will tell you somewhere in the Ohio Valley region or up into the Northeast. They probably have the best forages out there, mostly
hmm
because of climate. What we deal with, the problem that we have, and the reason I say we have the most potential, is we are in a subtropical into a subtemperate environment. We're kind of a transition zone. We're in between. So we
hmm
can grow the tropical forages and we can grow the temperate forages. So we get warm season and cool season down here. And that works for us because in the state of Alabama, we really have the potential, depending on location and conditions, we have the potential for a 365-day grazing program.
I
They
know.
don't have that if you go to Ohio or Pennsylvania, New York, but their forages when they do grow them are going to beat ours usually. And the reason for that is they are squarely within a temperate region. Temperate forages, if you put them just on a pound for pound basis, are higher quality than tropical forages. It has to do with their carbon mechanisms, how they bring in CO2, how they move CO2 through the cells. It's a complex mechanism of the photosynthetic pathway that I teach in some of my classes. But they don't have as high a fiber. They're not quite as resilient is the way I would describe tropical forages, and they don't have that. So you end up with a lot more lush pastures. That's where alfalfa grows rampant, orchard grass,
Yes.
timothy, all of those things that we think of as they're really, really high quality forages. They can grow them easily there because of their climatic conditions. But they've got a trade off in that where I can potentially grow forage 365 days a year, they're going to be doing good to get 180.
But that alfalfa is really great.
It is. It is. And so
It is for
and that's why I say that's the trade off is if you look at just the best forage at the time you're growing it, I would give the nod to them. If you look at forage potential, I'm going to show my bias and tell you that the Southeast is probably the best because we do have both seasons. And while, yes, the tropical forages aren't as good, some forage is better than no forage.
right, right. That's true. And we do have beautiful ryegrass in the winter.
We
So
do have beautiful ryegrass.
we have beautiful ryegrass. We started doing plotting on a map where the highest marbling stakes came from. And we've been
Okay.
doing that for several years now in our competition because, in Japan, they have certain areas that they designate as the best stakes come from here, come from there. And the government gives them a big premium for it. I wish we could do that here because I was really surprised at where they came from, but it was the heartland area of the U.S. And then Texas, Texas is about to catch up, though. I'm telling you, they're right on the heels.
I
Uh,
believe that. I believe that. I
but
spent a good number of years of my career. So the 8 years before I moved back to Alabama, I spent in Texas, and they've got a lot of good things out there. Now, the one thing I will say is Texas just beats us in numbers.
yeah,
It's really good to find the high end of everything when you're dealing with a game of numbers.
right, right. That's right. But as far as, conditions for cattle, weather wise, temperature wise, I kind of like the middle part of the U.S. I mean, in the South, it's extremely hot in the southern area. And
It
you
is.
said you were in South Alabama near Florida?
Yes, ma'am. I grew up just outside Dothan.
Oh, I know right where you were. Well, we call Pensacola in that area. We just call that L.A. Lower Alabama.
It pretty much is. Yeah,
Yeah,
I always knew about LA growing up. It wasn't until I moved to Arkansas that I got told that I was from UCLA.
yeah, me too. Yeah,
I was told I was from UCLA, the ugly corner of Lower Alabama, and I took offense to that
yeah,
one.
yeah. It's funny how we designate those areas, but I just I. So I also want to know now about I want to know about storing hay because
Okay.
I do not leave my hay outside, but a lot of people do. Now tell me what happens. I always put mine, in storage.
Okay.
But I know
So
a lot of people leave their hay outside. They don't have places to store it. But doesn't a lot of fermentation go on when it's left outside? I worry about that for my cattle, because of microbes. I'm big
sure,
in
sure.
checking on the microbes. But you want to tell me, because I need someone to tell me if I'm on the right track or not.
Well, you're definitely on the right track. Hay storage, it's a field all to itself. There's evidence to show. So there were reports, and I remember learning this when I was in school. There are reports to say that when some of the Egyptian pyramids were opened up, they had small, square hay bales or hay piles that had put in with some of the pharaohs that were still testing when they looked at the hay. It was still good quality thousands of years later.
Oh my.
And so that kind of goes into what you're talking about in terms of the storage. I can tell you, I grew up, hay was stored outside. Now, what I learned in school and what I learned through studying is that's the absolute worst way you can do it. What's happening? There's two things going on with hay is stored outside, and you've hit on one of them. Is you get microbial activity. The
Right.
microbes, the bacteria, they're naturally occurring in the environment. It's not necessarily that you got a bad thing that our microbes are there. They're there naturally. But you give them enough water and they start to become more active. And when they become more active, yes, you've got some fermentation happening. And so they're converting some of that cell wall into their byproducts, usually things like acetic acid and lactic acid. Not necessarily a bad thing. That's what we see in silage. That's what makes silage good is microbial fermentation. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is they're getting oxygen the whole time they're doing it. And so while you got the ones over here doing acetic and lactic acid, you got the other ones over here that are producing things like molds and spoilage. And so you end
Right.
up with some moldy hay or spoiled hay.
Decomposition and black.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you end up losing a lot of hay that way because with the oxygen that's present, you're not going to get the good fermentation. You're going to get spoilage. Um, the other thing that's happening is you've got the activity of water. And so the whole process of hay, the whole idea behind hay is saving a forage that used to be on the root. It used to be a very wet, lush material and saving it for later. And the whole process behind hay is dry it as quickly as possible. Because as you dry it, the enzymes that the plant produce that are there to try to save the plant, to burn up any sugars that might be present, to use up any nitrogen, to try to keep the plant alive, can only be active while there's water present. And so the idea behind hay production is remove the water. Those enzymes are no longer active. And so whatever sugar or protein or anything that was there stays there.
Mm-hmm.
And so as it's drying down, that's happening. You're getting a little bit of respiration. The plant's still trying to stay alive, but the quicker it dries, the better. When you get something like rain on it, if you get rain early on, that enzymatic activity starts back up again because as it's drying down, it still has a little bit of moisture. You give it a little more, and all of a sudden the enzymes perk back up and they start acting again, and you start burning more sugar, you burn more protein. If it's later during long-term storage, what's happening is you're normally not going to see a lot of respiration happen. You're not going to reactivate the enzymes. But what's happened is as you put this hay together, you've cut the plant off from the root. So there's a wound, there's an open spot in the plant. And then as that plant was baled, you've crushed certain cell walls. You've crushed some cell walls along the way. That water then seeps into those cell walls, and sugars and proteins are fairly soluble. And so as that water seeps through, not only do you have bacteria that are acting up and you're starting to get spoilage, but you're starting to seep out sugar and protein, which are part of the big thing behind hay. And so you end up with a hay that is lower in protein, lower in sugar, higher in fiber, lower digestibility.
Right. So at some point, you end up with the hay just serving as a fiber
And
product without a
absolutely,
lot of
the hay is a
nutritional
filler at that
value
point.
to it. Hmm.
Hay is a filler at that point. And so the ideal scenario, I mean, if you could be like the Egyptians, you store it in a hermetically sealed pyramid, go for it. But I don't think any of us have that.
Let me call my engineer tomorrow.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are throwing pyramids up in the back 40. So that's probably not the way that we're going to go. But the more that you can keep hay out of the weather, the better. And so there are a lot of ways you can do this. There are some people that are going to store outside anyway. There's no other way. They're not going to put up a structure. And so there are ways to store outside that can minimize the loss. We always tell you, stack the hay where the flat end is next to each other if you're dealing with round bales. And so most cow producers are dealing rounds. Flat ends next to each other. Stack them in a line that runs north-south. And if you stack them in a line that runs north-south, sun moves east-west, it gets the most sun exposure during the day, so it dries it out. Make sure that the rows have space between them. You don't want them up next to each other with the rounds next to each other. You want space that allows water to run through. Ideally, you put them under some structure. If you can put up a pole barn of some kind, that keeps rain off the top. Now, they can still wick moisture up from the soil, and so we normally say if you can pour a concrete slab underneath them, that's better. But again, it's kind of like we were talking earlier, some forage is better than no forage.
Right.
Something's better than nothing. So if you can get them under a pole barn, I'm not going to tell you, well, it has to have a slab and it has to have sides. And, if I'm going out and designing one today and I've got unlimited funds, yes, I'm putting sides in the slab. But, it's whatever you can do. Keep it out of the weather as much as possible. That's really the name of the game.
Right. And in my barn, I left some ventilation areas, for hay that we put in there. And of course, I always use a temperature probe when it comes right out of the field to make sure we don't have a fire. And you might want to talk about that for a minute. I've run across people that didn't know that you can burn your place down.
You absolutely can. Spontaneous hay fires or something. This is one of the only times that I will say spontaneous combustion is a real thing. And it is in hay. The big thing, the ideal hay storage, we love to see 15% or less moisture. And so that would be ideal. Now, you and I were just talking, hay production is as much of an art as a science, because as soon as you try to put hay up, you're going to end up with a rain.
That's
and
right.
So getting that 15% moisture, especially in the South in the summertime, is almost impossible. Because you can get it down to about 25%. The humidity is high enough that it's slowing down how it's dropping, and the rain shower's on the way. And so a lot of people will put it up a little too wet.
Right.
Knowing that it's going to lose some moisture when it gets put up. Now, I'm representing Auburn University tonight, so I'm not allowed to say that that's a good idea. You don't need to put up wet hay. And I stick by it. Don't put up wet hay if you can help it. But some people are going to put it up a little wet because it's going to lose a few percent in storage. The big thing is what we were talking about, the microbial activity. The less ventilation you have, the more that they're stacked together. So I told you, stack the flat ends together, but the rows need spacing. It's even worse in squares because a lot of people will stack squares where there's no airflow whatsoever.
None at all, right.
Well, the big thing is when those microbes start fermenting, when you start getting fermentation, you start getting respiration, they produce heat in addition to their byproducts. And so it's no different than after you and I eat a meal. If you were to stick a temperature probe right at your stomach, you're going to see a little bit of heat. Digestion produces heat.
Right.
It's the inefficiency of digestion. Well, that's what's happening with the microbes. They're producing their byproducts, but they're also releasing heat. If you've got airflow between those bales, then that heat can dissipate. And so you're cooling it off. You've got airflow that's moving the heat past, and you've got some transition of the temperature. When those bales are stacked together and there's no airflow, then the heat that they're producing continues building, and all of a sudden now it's catching fire. You're getting to the combustion point of fiber, of cellulose, and it catches fire. And so it sounds counterintuitive, but wet hay produces fires.
Right.
That's the exact answer. Wet hay is a fire hazard.
Is it the wet hay or is it the microbiotic action in the hay that produces the
it's
heat?
both. It's both. The heat itself is produced by the microbes, but you can't get the microbial activity without wet hay.
Without water, yeah. Without it being wet.
We normally tell farmers wet hay is the cause of the hay fire, and that's kind of burying the lead. You're right. It's the microbes that are doing the fermentation, but they're allowed to ferment because of the wet hay.
Right. So it isn't a good idea. I've seen people do this when they cut their hay and put it outside. They put tarps over it with the sun. I'm thinking, oh, they're cooking up some hay under there,
I haven't seen that happen very much, but I'd say that's probably not a great idea to throw a tarp over.
No, not good, not good. But
If you're in the situation where you need to cover it up or do something like that, I would say that going into a haylage or a baleage is probably a better option than trying to tarp it to keep the rain off of it or put up wet hay.
right.
Yeah,
Well,
by doing baleage or silage, you're allowing the moisture to stay and you're preserving it in liquid.
and they may have just done that because they might have had a storm coming and they wanted to cover it, and because they may have been able to move it the next day, or who knows. But I did see them covering them with tarps, and I thought, oh, that's not good. But I didn't say anything.
So the only time a tarp comes into play is if they are storing outside and it's permanent outside storage. Then
Mm-hmm.
what we'll see is people will stack them in a triangle, so 2 rounds with 1 round on top, tarp the whole thing. And what's happening there is they're trying to let it shed water. So instead of the
Mm-hmm.
water seeping in, they're shedding water, and that is an option. So that's another way that you can store outside. Again, not as good as inside storage.
Right, right. Are you seeing any new technology coming out in the marketplace to purchase for hay or for grasses, something really great that's come out that's resistant to things or fast growing, or a really great product that you've had experience with?
Um, Yes and no. So I try to keep my ear to the ground about that, and I love. So part of my research right now is testing the different forage varieties. I mean, that's where
Mm-hmm.
my grass shoots are working now. Is taking the new varieties they're releasing, comparing them to the staples that we have, seeing if there's any improvement. So yeah, there's some pretty good work. We've got a plant breeder out of Florida that's working on a new Bermuda grass variety. We haven't had a new Bermuda grass variety in several years. So
Right, and I
they're
have
working on the
Bermuda.
yeah, they're working on that. That's going pretty well. Of course, up in your area, tall fescue is a big thing, and
Yeah, I don't really like it that much. That's why I'm asking you because I want to change out a pasture that I have. I don't know. I'm not happy with it.
I understand they've come out with some new lines of tall fescue, some of the novel endophyte fescues, and so that's part of the technology side is the endophyte, the fungus that does not produce the toxin that we associate with tall fescue, and those are
Right.
showing some promise. Establishment's a little difficult, but those are showing some promise.
Okay, good, good.
Okay.
When I do my ryegrass, some people say, oh, you can just, spread it. And other people say you need to drill it. So, what is the truth? Tell me, what's the best thing to do? Spread or drill? Or one guy told me, you need to throw your seed out there and then let cows walk on it and they'll put it in the ground for you. And I said, well, that's probably the cheapest way I can do it, but it's probably not very
Oh,
effective.
well, I will tell you that all the people you talk to are correct. All of
Oh,
those
okay.
ways, all of those ways are possible. And so I'll tell you, we were talking before the show, and I was telling you that I put out some ryegrass on my lawn here in town. I just spread the seed. I just spread the seed on the ground and let it take. And that was growing up. That was what we did too. We broadcast the seed in the pasture, and we let the cattle walk on. Now that we didn't let the cattle walk on it to press it in the ground, we let them walk on it because there was still grass there, and we needed them to graze before we pulled them off. So broadcasting is a way. You're right. It's the low input way. It's the easiest way. If you don't have a lot of equipment, you don't have a lot of land prep, you just go out there, you put the seed, but your establishment rate is the lowest. You've got to up the amount of seed that you're putting out, and your germination rate is going to be lower. So it's
Okay.
possible, but it's not as efficient. If you've got access to a seed drill, a no-till seed drill is the best way to go just because you're ensuring that the seed makes contact with the soil. And so your germination rate's higher. You can use less seed than you would in broadcast. But it's really, as I'm talking with producers, as I'm visiting with some of my extension colleagues and visiting with producers, it's really a matter of what you've got access to. You know,
Right.
are you low input or are you a little more progressive, a little more machinery? And both are viable options, just a matter of what can you do.
Well, how much better does the drill work? I have to take these things into consideration before I buy a piece of equipment. And I can't seem to get anybody to tell me that drill's worth buying, but I think it would be because I want to have good results. And,
I'll tell you, the drill's normally worth buying. It's The break even's normally how many acres are you drilling, and so if you're not drilling very many acres, that's a big investment to put in for not many acres. And so normally what we see is you end up going in with a couple of your neighbors, a couple of different farmers, and purchasing the drill to use across properties. If you're
Right,
dealing with 5, 6, 700 acres, you can probably afford a drill no issue. If you're seeding 50 or 100 acres, it's going to be hard to justify buying a drill, and that's
right,
normally why we see people broadcast. I mean, it would all depend on the finances of the property, but that seems to be one of the biggest reasons that we see people not drill forages is the upfront cost of that no-till drill. Because there's
right.
only about 2 companies now. There might be 3 that produce those.
So I heard there's a new lime out, a better dissolving lime that is I don't know time spaced or whatever. Is there a new lime out or
Well, I haven't heard of one, but I won't say
okay?
there isn't. And that's where marketing comes in. They're always telling you there's a new something, there's a new this, there's a new
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah, this one cost a little more than
Oh yeah,
I
oh yeah.
used the year
I
before, and I'm
figure,
like, what does that lime do that makes it so special?
I figure.
No.
So here's the biggest thing to know when it comes to that. Lime is limestone. It's calcium carbonate. That's it.
Right, that's what it
So
is.
if there's technology with it, the only thing that really controls the effectiveness of limestone is the grind size. The finer the grind size, the quicker it works. And so what it sounds like they're telling you on this one is they may have it encapsulated, so they may have it coated so that it's time release.
That's what they said, time release, and I'm thinking, time release lime? I mean, it was, a hard concept for me. I haven't had time to look it up online, but I'm
Well,
like, okay.
that's what it sounds like. And time release is a good technology in fertilizers. Time release nitrogen has been a game changer in a lot of ways because then it allows you to have spread out application, and so it's good.
Mhm.
I'm not sure, and I would have to look at the data. Like I said, I'm not aware of the new technology with that. I would have to look at the data. In general, usually what we want to see with limestone is we don't want to see a time release. We want to see it act now because most people that are
Right.
putting out limestone have extremely acidic pastures that need to get corrected quickly.
And limestone takes its time anyway, doesn't it? I mean, it takes forever to get in there and do its job.
It does. It's not a quick process. It's normally a 6 month to a year process.
Mhm.
And I mean, sadly, where we are, you and I are, a lot of people that are putting out limestone, they're trying to correct acidic soils down in the fives. And
Yeah,
to get them out of a 4.8 or a 5.3, it's going to take multiple years to get them up closer to 7 because there is a maximum amount of lime you can put out a year. You usually don't want to see more than a ton per acre per year just because you're starting to stack up a lot of material that's not going to get incorporated very well. So
right.
I'm not sure. Like I said, I'm not familiar with that. Normally, when I'm talking to people about limestone, I'm just telling them the finer the grind size you can get, the better, because that incorporates better. If you've got little rock chunks and pebbles in there, that's not going to break down and work very well.
That's going to time release all on its own.
Exactly. That's going to be a natural time release.
That's
But
right.
the time scale on that one may be longer than you got.
I know. That's what I'm thinking. Well, do you have any great pointers for us as far as forage or you want to tell us any new things coming down the tube or?
My main thing on forage is the forage management side, and it's kind of like we were talking about on hay earlier, but it's paying attention to pastures and understanding that one thing that we preach in my program here, and the beef and forage program here at Auburn, is you're not a cattle farmer, you're a grass farmer, you're a
That's
forage
right.
farmer, and,
That's
and
right.
that's really what we preach is take care of the forage, it'll take care of you.
So if you had to rate forage as far as palatability and nutrition, for cattle, what can you rate like the top five?
Ooh,
I'm sorry I put you on the spot on that one, but I mean, I would like to know what the.
well, it's all going to depend on region because it's a matter of what you can grow. I will tell you that cattle preference is always going to be an annual versus a perennial because it's a lusher forage. And so something like a ryegrass is usually going to be more preference, higher quality than a Bermuda grass. And so I will tell you, annual is better than perennial for forage quality and palatability. Legume is better than grass for
Yes,
quality and
legume.
palatability. And cool season is normally better than warm season. And so
Right.
if you start getting within species and comparing, let's just say tall fescue versus Bermuda grass, it's not a fair comparison there because there are certain varieties of tall fescue that are worse off than Bermuda grass and vice versa. It's a variety and a breed thing, but I can say that those three comparisons, legume over grass, annual over perennial, and cool over warm, definitely hold true in terms of rank.
Now that you said legume, I do want to ask you about something that I had in my pasture. It's a legume, and they
Okay.
said they did studies on it years ago. It's cerisa grass. I have an actual. When I bought it, I had 30 acres of cerisa grass in one small hayfield, and I mean it was pretty, but I didn't know anything about it. But the cows, they don't really like that stuff. I mean, they eat it, but it's not like, alfalfa or
Right.
kudzu, like they'll eat off the trees. I mean, I don't know why we're not using kudzu for some kind of cattle feed as much as it grows.
Well, interesting you bring that up. I had an undergraduate student working on a kudzu project last year. We were looking at Nutrivalley kudzu. It was originally brought over here as a hay crop. They used it back in the 20s as a hay crop. So
They
we were
did
trying
use
to.
it as a hay crop?
They did.
How did they deal with the the vines on it?
That is a very good question, and if I ever figure that out, I'll let you know because when we were dealing with it, that was the problem we had. You can bale some vine crops. I mean, they bale peanut vines a lot,
Now
and
my cattle love
so you can
peanut
deal with the
crop.
vines. But no, kudzu is good. The problem with kudzu is the few grazing studies they've done, it doesn't handle with grazing very well, and so they tend to, if they can graze it, they'll take it out.
Yeah, that
Um,
happened here. On every farm there is no kudzu, but you go down the road and the electric company has a time with it.
yes, they do. Yes, they do.
And
But
for all of you that don't know, is it only in the South? I mean, it is an
it's pretty
invasive
much
species
nationwide.
like you would, but it's not it's not, it's not something that's really, it is really bad though, isn't it? I mean, it's not
It
bad
is.
for
It
cattle owners
it's an
because the
invasive
cattle eat it.
weed. It's an invasive weed. It is bad. It exists in a lot of the country, but it's only a problem in the South, and most of that is the places up north that it does exist. It dies in the wintertime. It dies back.
Right,
We don't ever get cold enough for it to die. It'll die back a little, but we never get cold enough to actually kill it, and so it never truly goes away. That's why we
right.
have such a problem with it. And so the original reason they brought it over here, the Soil Conservation Service brought it to stabilize hillsides and roadsides, and then we started using it as a hay crop, and then it just got away from us.
Yeah. So they realized they really didn't do too good on that one.
No, no, it's yeah, the good intentions thing. But you
And
were asking about what you were calling Sericea grass. That's Sericea lespedeza.
right,
So Sericea
Lespedeza.
lespedeza, it is a legume. There's been a lot of work done in Auburn on Sericea lespedeza. It's very good for small ruminants, sheep and goat. So sheep and goat absolutely love it. It produces what's known as condensed tannins, and those condensed tannins can bind protein. And so a lot of times when people hear condensed tannins, they start to think bad. It's not necessarily bad. It does bind protein, so you reduce some protein digestibility. But you also, we've seen over the years, there's been a decrease in methane output, which for
Uh-huh.
environmental concerns has always been good. On the sheep and goat side, though, it combats internal parasites. And so a lot of times they would use that because it has some anthelmintic activity
I
against things like
read
marble failure.
that. I read that it would do that with cattle too.
It will.
But
It
I
will.
mean,
Cattle
you
don't like
can't.
it as well.
No, they don't like it. They kind of look at it and look at you and then look back at it, but then they eat it. But one of the problems with it is I couldn't find a eco-friendly spray that I could use on my weeds that didn't kill the legume, that didn't kill the Cerisa too, because it was a legume. So it just became too much, of a problem to try to let it grow naturally. And then there were so many weeds if I kept,
Yes.
had a legume crop. So I
Yes,
changed it
and
out.
that's one of the concerns we have when it comes to mixed species pastures. Is
Hmm.
when you start mixing species, it's very good in terms of nutrition. It's very good in terms of pasture health, soil health, but things like pest management become an issue because you run out of herbicides and pesticides that you can use that won't affect one or the other.
Well, did they grow that Cerisa in Texas too? Because they told me that it was like a replacement for alfalfa in the protein content. And you know,
So protein wise, it's very close. It's very similar. I've heard it called a poor man's alfalfa. I've heard that term before, and yes, they did grow it in Texas. It's not a bad forage. If you can get animals adjusted to it, and it's kind of like any forage. Most new forages they're not going to go to right away. I mean, we talk the same thing. We work with brassicas, so turnip, radish, things like collard, things like that. They don't like them initially. They
they
don't
didn't
just
like
automatically
collards.
they don't like them initially. They don't go to them automatically, but you let them adjust to it, and over time they start grazing it. So it's kind of the same thing with Ceresia.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I didn't know because I had a pasture that and I heard that they brought it in and tried it in Texas and the southern states to, replace alfalfa, but for some reason it just didn't go. So,
It's like most things that they're slow to take on and they never fully take.
right. Well, Dr. Smith, I have just enjoyed talking to you so much, and I'll just tell everybody his students just love him to death. They just love Dr. Smith, and he is such a good teacher. And Auburn is really lucky to have him. And I'm so glad you came on the program. I really thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Daisy. I appreciate it. It's been fun.
Okay, well, we hope y'all have enjoyed it, and we will talk to you on our next podcast. Bye.